Let me tell you where we have support, because it's fashionable now, and in many countries, because their media and their social media are inundated with anti-Israel, anti-Semitic material. Many leaders, call me up and say, "Hey, look, I've got this problem with public opinion, but I want you to know we respect you. And can we make some deals? And can you teach us some of the things that your military does? And can we have some of your AI and cyber expertise?" Israel is the number 2 country in cyber in the world, and our technology is absurd. It's so good. The relations are not quite as they appear, and we have many, many friends. And I have to tell you, we also take care of our friends, especially the Christians in the Middle East. The Christian villages in Lebanon, some of them have actually asked to be annexed to Israel because we protect them against the Hezbollah fanatics who want to kill them. And we do the same things with Christians everywhere.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafzeli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying but so far from dead.
There have been many agreements between Arab states and Israel, such as the Camp David Accords that normalized relations with Egypt, or the Wadi Araba Treaty that normalized relations with Jordan. Most of these have entailed a withdrawal of Israeli troops from a country's territory, or at the very least, the settling of territorial disputes between the two states, either on land or in the sea. Even the failed May 17th agreement in 1983, signed between Israel and President Amin Gemayel during the Lebanese Civil War, included a withdrawal of the IDF from the country, with the Lebanese army moving to occupy all of its former positions. The framework agreement signed on June 26, 2026, between Lebanon and Israel, however, is undeniably a confounding one.
What's confounding about it is that Lebanon seems to have put itself on a pathway to normalization with Israel and effectively approved of the occupation of Lebanese land for next to nothing in return. The deal stipulates that Israel can stay in southern Lebanon, vast tracts of which it is currently occupying with military force, until Hezbollah is disarmed. But the Lebanese army is fundamentally incapable of achieving that objective.
The MOU between Iran and the United States was supposed to guarantee the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon, and this was a guarantee given to the Iranians by Trump himself in return for the Iranian military not striking Israel in retaliation for the IDF's ceasefire violations in South Beirut. But despite this agreement, and despite pressure mounting on the Israelis to hold up their end of that deal, the government in Beirut has now gone around the Iranians, attempting to forge a deal of their own with even worse terms for themselves.
This follows in the recent pattern of the Lebanese state in an effort to expel Iranian influence over its political reality, actually undermining its own interests by ceding land, rights, and power to the voracious and belligerent settler colony on its southern border. The play, it seems, is to win the favor of the dying hegemon, the United States, through supplication alone. It's not only absurd, it's also a very dangerous game. The Israelis clearly want to tank the US MOU with Iran, an outcome that would almost certainly lead to more bloodshed.
In 1969, the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Lebanese army came to an agreement allowing Palestinian armed groups to operate from Lebanese soil, with the understanding that Palestinian armed struggle is, quote, an act that comes in the interest of Lebanon, unquote. Such an agreement is impossible to comprehend now, with a desire for quote-unquote sovereignty above all else guiding Lebanese political decisions, even if it means giving over territorial control of the South to Israel for an indefinite period.
Where we go from here, both in Lebanon and the broader region, is yet to be determined. Israel is signaling a desire to expand territorially in both Lebanon and Syria. The US is holding on to a relatively fragile arrangement with Iran and still trying to undermine the Islamic Republic's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. Regional players seem to be waiting to see how these various diplomatic and quasi-diplomatic efforts shake out, and they are increasingly hedging against a sustained US presence in the Middle East, or at least not at the level we're accustomed to.
For all this, we spoke with senior editor at Al-Quds Al-Arabi, Nasser Elamine, a writer and researcher focusing on Middle Eastern geopolitics and the recent author of the article Interim Contours from the New Left Review. Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us. We are speaking today with Nasser Elamine. He is the senior editor at Al-Quds Al-Arabi, and he joins us today from the United Kingdom. Nasser, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So, this agreement that has been brokered between Israel and Lebanon, I've seen many people having different reactions to it, and at least in my circle, you read about people talking about this as if it's worse than the Camp David Accords, that it's worse than the 1983 agreement that Lebanon under the Gemayels achieved with Israel during that civil war, despite the fact that Lebanon ostensibly, nominally, is not recognizing Israel in the same way that maybe Egypt or Jordan did during their respective agreements. So can you detail for listeners what is actually in this agreement, and why are people saying that it is more humiliating than other Arab quote-unquote peace agreements?
I mean, comparing it to 1983 in the beginning, at the very least, there is an article in 1983 agreement that stipulates very clearly that there will be an Israeli retreat from Lebanon. This doesn't exist in this agreement now. There's the language of deployment and redeployment. I mean, it's kind of the same in terms of the conditionality of retreat, in the sense that both stipulated that the Lebanese armed forces had to ensure that there would be no other form of militias or armed forces in the south before Israeli retreat would happen. But the kind of language that's used in this one, there's no time frame for retreat. 2, the word retreat doesn't even come up. It comes up in sort of passive language where the Basically, Israel stresses that it has no interests in Lebanon outside of, responding to its security concerns about Hezbollah.
The phrase that they used was territorial ambitions, denying that they had any of that, but that's very vague.
It comes in the form of a sort of a hypothetical, it's like, one, Israel is not concerned, or Israel is responding to a threat. Two, if that threat did not exist, then Israel would have no interest in Lebanon. And third, stressing that we have no territorial ambitions, right? But there's no claim, and there's no article where Israel explicitly says they will retreat. And almost immediately after this agreement was signed, the Israelis, Netanyahu, Katz, other officials came out and immediately said, we will not be leaving the security zone. In fact, they framed it as an achievement, which exactly it was that for them. They immediately argued, we've pushed the Iranians out of the conversation, one. Two, we've achieved, or at least legitimized our presence in an agreement that places no time frame on them to leave, So in that sense, it's deeply humiliating. But furthermore, there's also an additional thing that makes it humiliating, or at least confusing. It's the fact that the MOU had already secured a ceasefire and had, at least in some stronger phrasing, Article 1 of the MOU says that the signatories will have to guarantee Lebanon's territorial integrity and sovereignty, right? Each side is going to interpret that however they want, but essentially it means at some point, at least, there has to be a retreat. And it ensures, at least it guarantees, and Iran, I think, did so with fire, guaranteed a ceasefire. So there was space, there was time, The Lebanese government had time to stall, to think, to communicate with other leaders, Arab leaders, to figure out what else they could do. They didn't have to sign this immediately. I think that is what the most worrying aspect of it.
What interests me about the reaction regarding this agreement is that want to undermine this Iranian track that is already attempting with military backing to get the Israelis completely out of the country. Mm. And the spin that comes out of both Beirut and Tel Aviv, they're both on the same page that this is meant to stick it to the Iranians specifically. And I'm curious, how did this demand for Iranian withdrawal become this bogeyman to the Lebanese government, where they were willing to accept an indefinite military occupation of the south that was more palatable to them rather than accept an Iranian forced withdrawal of the Israelis from the country? How did that become more palatable than the other?
It sort of extends to before this war, to the period between, the first ceasefire and February 28th, where the situation was perceived perhaps everywhere in the world, but especially in Lebanon, that Iran had permanently retreated from the region, forced out of the region through the fall of the Assad regime and through sort of the defeat of Hezbollah. That was swift, it was painful, it seemed permanent to everyone. So the attitude in Lebanon, at least among the sort of the opposition to Hezbollah, was that Hezbollah is over. Militarily, it's over. And that sort of Iranian guardianship was no more. As in, Iran was incapable now of supporting Hezbollah. And so I think it began there, where the situation was so bleak. And there was a very obvious, I think, material conflict of interest between people in the south and the rest of Lebanon, where the rest of Lebanon wanted to sort of move on from this, while the south was still occupied, And so I think already then there was this idea that, if Lebanon had to forego, sovereignty over certain parts of the south in return for ensured peace, some sort of agreement mediated by the US, given that we were now, or at least it was perceived at the time, and perhaps we were at the time, in a sort of Israeli era of hegemony over the region in its entirety, then this was the best deal you could come up with, The best you could have was a sort of, a Russia-Ukraine situation where Ukraine would have to negotiate some sort of concession on land and accept some loss of land because this is the fact of the war. At least that's how it's thought of. When February 28th happened, I think it was surprising to everyone that Hezbollah had rehabilitated itself. That wasn't something that anyone had in mind. It was entirely unpredicted, And so I think the Lebanese government which had already come through a mandate to disarm Hezbollah, made a miscalculation there when they rushed to, again, it's this problem of rushing into making these diplomatic concessions. It was Lebanon, or the president of Lebanon, that first approached Israelis for talks. And, they just ignored him because they weren't profitable to them. They made no sense to them. They were advancing militarily. So I think from that point, from that sort of initial miscalculation that Iran was going to be defeated in this war, that was sort of decided that this would be the Lebanese government's strategy. And I might be wrong about this, but I do think there was a general attitude in the country where this sort of trade-off was now becoming more and more acceptable, at least to people outside of the South.
So if we assess both of these deals together, and I'm thinking about the memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Iran that ended the U.S.-Israeli, or perhaps has ended or paused the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, that had this first clause that pertained to Lebanon and at least purported to restrict Israeli military action in southern Lebanon, and then this Israel-Lebanon framework agreement that's been recently executed. If we think about them together, I think we can see the shape of Israeli strategy here, because Netanyahu clearly felt boxed in by the U.S.-Iran MOU, which, it does seem to have had an effect on Israeli, quote unquote, freedom of action militarily. Because, at least for now, it seems that the U.S. is willing to put some amount of pressure on Israel, at least signal a willingness to put some amount of pressure on Israel to be bound by it. And that really leaves Bibi in a tough position domestically, right? Because the popular sentiment in Israel seems to be that both the Iran and the Lebanon campaigns have been, up until now, if we take that late February starting point, have been essentially a strategic failure. So it seems like what he's trying to do is either undermine the MOU entirely through this diplomatic poison pill, or continue the Lebanon campaign through other means, namely this diplomatic track. And I guess my question for you is how you assess this strategy on the part of the Israelis. Because you talked about the Lebanese state perhaps have miscalculating, but I think there's an argument to be made that by catalyzing this entire sequence, coming from that point of questionable Israeli hegemony through 2024 and 2025, and then pushing things further, pushing the U.S. to launch this war, I think there is potentially an argument to be made that Netanyahu has overplayed his hand. But I'm curious what your assessment is.
No, it seems to be the case right now, because before the February 28 war, the situation looked like what Israel needed to do now was to consolidate, to transfer what it had achieved through military might into some sort of political order in the region. And they had already started signaling towards this when they started talking of, I think it was Netanyahu at the time, who said, the Arabs will normalize with us, but they'll normalize on our terms. This was not the language they were using during the Abraham Accords, because then there was some sort of common objective between certain Gulf countries and Israel to create some sort of access to counter the resistance axis, Iran's forward defense. And so the language completely changed, right? But I think the problem was that Israel really did need to defeat Iran to be able to make that move, right? Especially given sort of the renormalization of relations between the Gulf and Iran during the last few years, and the fact that it had survived October 7th. So I think in the Israeli mind and Netanyahu's mind, setting aside internal politics, because definitely that is a huge issue, he needs to extend the war to win elections. But that aside, the calculation maybe is correct. You need to take out Iran to be able to consolidate power and sort of position yourself as the local hegemon, transform the Middle East into your sphere of influence. The problem with that, it's incredibly difficult, And so whether he was convinced that if he killed Khamenei and the top leaders in the IRGC, whether that would change anything, whether it would destroy the regime, cause the regime to fall, I don't know. But he must have thought something to that tune, because he had to have known that the war was going to be short. He couldn't have thought that American interests were going to align with Israeli interests long term for a long, war for months, a year, whatever. He had to know it was going to be a short window. And so he had to have thought that he could that American and Israeli forces would be able to defeat Iran in that small period of time, or at least substantially weaken it. Why they thought that, I don't know, given, normal people online were thinking otherwise. So I don't know what made them think this, but that is where the miscalculation was. It was definitely a miscalculation on Israel's part. And then they ended up in a situation where their aspiration prior to February 28th was regional domination. Now it's security zones, So yeah, it was definitely miscalculation on their part as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right that he anticipated and wanted a short war. I remember kind of early on, sometime in March, Netanyahu's speaking publicly and he says this kind of sly remark of like, oh, this is going to be over sooner than you think. Like clearly that was their military strategy. And it seemed like they kind of correctly, from my view, it seemed like they correctly identified that Iran's main card is their missile program. And that they are a missile power, and that if you can take out the Iranian missiles, then you will have defanged them militarily for the most part. And what they failed to realize, is how hard that would be. That they had invested very heavily in protecting that missile program, and that you can have the biggest fucking bombs in the world, but reinforced concrete can do a lot in protecting those missile cities. I think that's like been a major lesson for everyone watching this. But I kind of wanted to talk more about the kind of kinetic aspect of how this has all played out over the past couple of years, because something that followers of military developments in this region have come to become acquainted with is the concept of these deterrence equations, right? And, in the logic of the Cold War, and really when we're speaking about nuclear deterrence, that tends to stay in the realm of the hypothetical, where all of these force systems are in place and there's this strategic signaling to prevent the big cascading sequence that results in mutually assured destruction. But in the regional war that we're talking about here, that encompasses Israel and Iran and Hezbollah, where so much of the conflict is happening at a level that is below the threshold of an all-out war, those deterrence equations actually play out on the battlefield, right? And we saw them with Hezbollah's strikes on Israel that started immediately after October 7th and culminated in the 2024 war, with Hezbollah targeting Haifa and Tel Aviv in response to strikes on Beirut. But what was interesting about this war, the war that started in 2026, is that it really fully regionalized. And those equations of deterrence grew increasingly complex through the linking of different arenas. So I'm curious if you could just talk about how the logic of deterrence evolved over the course of the war and how the battlefields in Lebanon and Iran became linked with each other.
I mean, they were already linked, but this link became actualized in this war. The resistance axis was built for this purpose. But the whole point, I think, for Iran, at least throughout the last 10 years, was, I think IRGC commanders said it several times, where they would tell you, our presence in Syria is justified by the fact that we don't want war to happen on our soil. So it's better for wars to happen over there. And I think this was also the logic for the Gulf, where, post 2013, after the Syrian revolution, proxy wars started to become a thing in the Middle East between all these different competing factions, whether it's the Gulf and Iran, Israel in the mix, Turkey, everyone. Well, at least at the time, the equation was that the wars could be contained in these in these countries where they were happening. So you could have a war in Yemen and it would not reflect in any way on the security situation in the Gulf. You could have a war in Syria and you have the IRGC occupying Syria, but at the same time, Iran wouldn't be affected. And it's the same with Lebanon and with Palestine. I think October 7th it was before, it was in 2019, when the Houthis actually attacked Saudi and the UAE, which led to everything really that's happening right now is the consequence of a moment of recalibration that happened in the Gulf, where they realized that these proxy wars were no longer viable, that they were losing the proxy wars. And this opened sort of this double track. One track was an attempt to sort of renegotiate terms with Iran, figure out how else other than in extended war can they deal with each other. And on the other track was the Abraham Accords, right, where certain Gulf countries and Israel saw that we could sort of avoid temporarily, momentarily, the Palestine problem, we can create a counter axis against Iran and their resistance axis. And really, this is where this logic of deterrence starts to become material in the region. And so I think post October 7th, that moment sort of brings it all forth. It actualizes this moment where Iran realized that perhaps, I mean, if you look at it in the beginning, Nasrallah, for example, would constantly be talking about this, we do not require Iran's aid. If we required Iran's aid, they would aid us, The point was that the war was still contained. There was this outcry among Arabs that, no Arab state moved when the genocide in Gaza was happening. It was precisely because it was still contained. Nothing needed to be done for them. As far as they were concerned, everything was still in place. It was the moment when these wars started to spill out that these sort of deterrence equations needed to start actualizing. And they started to spill out because Israel started to see that they were capable of maneuvering in a way that would allow them perhaps to expand their military dominance in the region and then, realize this sort of strategic version of Greater Israel. I think that is the moment when these two fronts link. But it basically fails in 2024 because Hezbollah is violently defeated. And so really we're seeing the first moment of it being in action now. I mean, we saw it in Yemen as well when the Houthis were sort of blocking the strait. But we're seeing the Lebanon and Iran front uniting now for the first time in action and sort of in a way where things are still progressing. So we need to see how that actually plays out in the future.
I'm just curious, before I pass it back to Seamus, whether you view the catalyzation of those linkages as part of what Sinwar and Hamas's strategy was with October 7th. And I guess to that end, if you do you view the kind of collapse of that in 2024 as a failure of that strategy, or was bringing Iran fully into the conflict anticipated from the outset? I mean, I ask that because, I'm sure you saw this letter that was, kind of questionable validity. I don't really know whether it was real or not. I mean, it came from the Israelis, so that's certainly a reason not to credence it. But it was, basically a letter where Qassam is saying that they're not expecting Iran to join in directly into the coming war. I'm curious what you make of that.
I mean, like I was saying before, this, October 7th is a consequence of the failure of those two tracks we were talking about post-2019 of birthing a new regional order. The regional order was disintegrating, and the way it was reforming once again was almost as if it was forgetting the Palestinians. It was like isolating them and subtracting them from the equation. And so whether Sinwar knew that Iran would eventually get involved, I mean, he must have speculated something of the sort, but to know is impossible. But I think the real question is what Nasrallah thought, because there have been endless wars against Gaza since 2005. And they've all been contained within Gaza. Sometimes a couple of Katyusha missiles will fly out of Lebanon and then Hezbollah will say it wasn't us and it will be done. This is the first time where Hezbollah actively decides to join.
I mean, I think that the question of Nasrallah's calculation on October 8th is a very important one. Because it was, on the one hand, this decision to enter in a way that they had never entered before. I mean, I think there was a lot about October 7th that was new, because it wasn't just a regular assault on Gaza as we had seen, every couple of years since 2005. It was an act initiated by the resistance, fully initiated by the resistance, not in response to some particular Israeli act of aggression.
I would disagree in the sense that October 7th was something that was planned years in the past, but it was advanced and expedited because there were Israeli plans for a devastating war against Gaza and assassinations, and they were attempting to preempt that. But yes, it was something that was done by Palestinian resistance organizations outside of any kind of Iranian influence or direction, and was absolutely antithetical to the Iranian political direction that existed at that time, in the words of Javad Zarif.
I mean, that's a great point. I think, though, the question from Hezbollah's point of view or Nasrallah's point of view is this it? Is this the war, right? Is this the Great War? Because, he had long been talking about this final confrontation that was coming. And it seemed like, if you're watching October 7th happen and Hamas break through the Israeli defenses and enter into Israel proper and exact the kind of losses that October 7th exacted, it's hard not to see how this wouldn't be it.
Mohammed Deif said he wanted a gigantic regional uprising involving Iran and all these different states explicitly.
Yeah. And then I guess the question that leads to is then if that is Nasrallah's calculation, then what is the military strategy that follows from that? Because I think a lot of observers are like, okay, well, Hezbollah has entered, but they have not fully entered. They're not acting like it's the Great War. So was that a part of a longer logic of escalation in terms of turning the war into the regional war that then becomes a war of attrition in which the resistance can have a chance at winning? Or is it this thing of realizing that it might be the moment, but not committing fully to its actualization? I think, of course, hindsight is 2020, and it's impossible to enter the minds of these commanders and these rulers and weighing all of these different things. But it's what's so crazy about this moment, right? Is that it did become the war. It did become the regional war. And whether that was kind of catalyzed by the logic of the resistance or catalyzed by the logic of imperial overaggression and overextension, I think is just a fascinating kind of micro-historical question to grapple with.
First of all, to the point of whether Nasrallah thought this was the war, I think Nasrallah was a very careful person in his thinking. He was very rational, very pragmatic in the way that he would think about things of this sort. So I don't think he would allow himself to develop any sort of grand idea of what this might amount to. But I think what he saw in it was two things. One, that if no one participated, then it would amount to just a ruthless, relentless sort of battering of Hamas, and then a complete genocide of the Palestinians, and then Israel would just sort of advance their plans, their long existing plans for Gaza. So that was one point. He saw the necessity of joining from that perspective, but also he saw perhaps sort of like a moment of negotiation between the resistance axis. They had to negotiate with each other through fire. So if Nasrallah decides to join, then he's changing the equation substantially. The Houthis have to start thinking now. The Iraqi resistance groups have to start thinking now. All these different, Bashar al-Assad has to start thinking now. And I think he was very obviously the weakest point or the weakest link in this whole axis, because he was already sort of pulling away from the Iranian axis at the time.
I remember when al-Assad was overthrown, there were Yemeni officials who were saying that they had specifically requested Assad to open a front in the Golan against Israel. And not only did he refuse, he later would expel the Yemeni representatives from Syria. He did not want any part of this at all.
Absolutely, and it was not just him. The whole idea was the strategy, the military strategy that they had, was that Hezbollah would enter through Julan. It wouldn't. The war wouldn't happen in South Lebanon. That was the whole point of it. For better or for worse. For worse for Syrians, it's a terrible strategy when you sort of think of it in terms of the influence it had on the actual people. But that was the strategy they had, where we could sort of avoid the whole Lebanon question. The whole idea of sort of dividing Lebanon across this sort of sectarian regional line about whether we should enter this war or not, by extending this war through the Syrian front, which was already in a war. Assad said no. And so that forced the war into this very small region, which is basically South Lebanon. But I do think that Nasrallah had to have thought, at least, perhaps in the early months, because I think the picture was incredibly bleak by the time, like before he was assassinated. But in the first few months, he must have thought that, if Hezbollah joins and then the Houthis join and then Iran would be compelled to act as well, the image would have been very different. And especially if this happened through Syria, perhaps that would have been the case,
Yeah, so, you had written, we talked about Hezbollah's calculus through 2024, but I wanted to ask about Hezbollah's calculus in this war, because you had written for Phenomenal World, I think about 1 or 2 weeks after they had entered the war, about their calculus, about the gamble, quote unquote, that you had said that they were making, where they would enter into this war and attempt to utilize Iranian military power to deter Israel and attempt to get some sort of better deal here. And I remember when they initially entered the war, obviously they bring up Khamenei's assassination, but they also bring up the fact that they've been waiting 15 months for diplomacy that never went anywhere, these daily airstrikes by Israel. And the questions that began in those early days from supporters of the party, I remember people were concerned about the timing, the direct response to Khamenei being the justification, so many people being forced to evacuate from the south. And I saw that those questions abated when Hezbollah was doing, comparatively to where people believed them to be before, quite well. But now that the Lebanese government has pulled the rug out from under them and from under the South more so, how do you see Hezbollah's gamble having worked out, if such an analysis can be made at the moment? Where do you see their strategy going from here?
Well, the gamble is ongoing. It's for Hezbollah, I think they've done what they can at this point. All they can do right now is sort of hold their ground, insist on responding to any sort of Israeli violations, insist on refusing the trilateral deal, and just wait to see how things pan out between Iran and the US. The thing is, even with this agreement, nothing is material in Lebanon yet, It's all happening between Iran and the US. The entire regional restructuring is happening there. Every single discussion that is happening in the region, whether it be in the Gulf and Iran, between Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, between the Americans and the Gulf, all of these are happening downstream to the main negotiations that are happening between Iran and the US. So I think for now, all that Hezbollah can do really is wait, because they have, to my mind, successfully done what they needed to do throughout that period. The question is whether that gamble will actually work or pan out. But it's very difficult to speculate from this point specifically, because things have sort of calmed down and we're just waiting.
Yeah, I think it's definitely too early to see whether and how it's worked. But one thing that has been clear is that on a tactical level, Hezbollah seems to have had much more success in this round in terms of inflicting costs on the Israeli military forces, certainly in comparison to the 2024 war, which, as we know, began with these, the devastating pager attacks and the assassination of top figures, etc., and resulted in this very lopsided ceasefire agreement that left Israel in control of Lebanese territory and allowed it to continue striking Hezbollah positions even as they ceased their fire from their side. But in this round, starting as we've been talking about from Hezbollah's re-entry into the conflict in early March, they seem to have been able to use new strategies and technologies. And in particular, I'm thinking about the FPV drones that they have started, they've deployed for the first time with increasing success. And, we've seen this kind of technology change the shape of warfare in the Russia and Ukraine war, and seems like it was only a matter of time before it made its way to other theaters. But I'm curious if you could speak to how Hezbollah was able to regroup under fire following that 2024 war, and how they've tactically reoriented their approach to repelling the Israelis. Because, it's the drones, but it's not just the drones. Like, it seems like they have kind of restructured their approach more broadly.
Yeah. Everyone's sort of talking about their return to guerrilla warfare, as if them having ballistic missiles was a weakness to them. The main idea, I think, was really the intelligence, the extent of the intelligence and security breach in the previous war, and the fact that they had almost no grasp of how deep it went. I think the primary thing that changed was they solved this, They no longer have access to those ballistic missiles, it seems at least. Otherwise, I think they would have used them in this war as well. Whether they're destroyed or buried, no one really knows. They claim buried. But I think the shift in tactics that they've used, that they've changed, it's sort of a return to, or at least perhaps they were freed of the burden of threatening Haifa and Tel Aviv and major Israeli cities. And the shift became, I think, more so about forcing an Israeli retreat rather than fighting one-to-one with Israel. It became asymmetric, and it became more so about pressuring Israel while they're inside of Lebanese territory, even if they expand. I think they understood this time, but perhaps they knew it prior as well, that they can't stop Israel from advancing. They can't stop a ground invasion. They can make a ground invasion difficult. They can make it costly in terms of people and also, equipment. And so, Israelis are referring to it as an integrated fire ambush strategy, where they use smaller units, smaller elite units that sort of draw Israelis into certain areas. They attack them with precision drones, with UAVs, and then they wait for the rescue mission to begin, and then they attack those as well. It's basically, the whole point of it is to put as much pressure on the Israelis as possible and to force them into a situation where they can't stabilize any sort of bases anywhere. Or at least so that the Israelis basically have to always be moving around. And the FPVs, I don't think the nets, that's the basic solution the Israelis have had to the FPVs. It's a real problem for them, for the Israelis. And that's why they wanted to escalate against Beirut at some point. And this is what led to that sort of actualization of a logic of deterrence, where Iran bombed Israel, attacked Israel in response to, or threatened to attack Israel, and then attacked Israel.
Yeah, it's interesting you describing them being kind of liberated of the responsibility of targeting these major Israeli cities, because it seems like what we have learned over the past several years of fighting is that these resistance strategies can kind of only function in concert with one another, which makes sense. Israel's strategy for the whole time has been to split the fronts, right? To split Gaza from Lebanon from Iran, to split Yemen off from everyone else and deal with them later, or whatever their plan is. But it does seem like these strategies work in concert, right? Yes, Hezbollah is, in a sense, liberated from focusing on Israeli population centers because they have a limited objective, which is to pressure Israel in southern Lebanon and kind of focus their fire on the Israeli north. But they're also, it seems like Iran is able to conserve some of its fire with respect to Israel by having that front open with Hezbollah. And that seemed to free them up, in a sense, to really focus on trying to split the Gulf off from the United States. So it is just fascinating to see these military strategies play out in real time. And I think that, there's all of these contestations about alliances and relationships. And really the struggle is to see what survives this. Once the guns do go silent, if they ever do, what are the formations that continue? And I think that is why Iran in particular puts so much emphasis on support for the Axis and on the Lebanese theater in general in its negotiations. I think there's a kind of tendency to either view this as like they're just using it as a bargaining chip cynically, or they have a religious commitment or something. And both of these modes of interpretation seem to miss the truth of the matter, like the real strategic logic of it, which is that it can only kind of function in this forward defense capacity. And that is a two-way street. It's not just in service of the Iranians, it's also in service of Hezbollah and their resistance objectives. Yeah, so I don't know. It's just, I don't really have a question here, but it's just a kind of like fascinating to see this play out. And, you mentioned the new formations that are emerging to try and make sense of the regional order as well as being kind of downstream of this broader conflict. And I think one thing that's been fascinating is to watch this formation of the Saudis and the Pakistanis and the Egyptians and the Turks trying to hedge perhaps in the fallout from this broader conflict. And, Yeah, I don't know what you make of that, whether you think there are, real efforts in the region to try to maybe untangle or untether from the perspective of some of these states from the U.S. Israeli security power structure in the region, or even just the Americans in the region, and to try and hedge for a post-war reality in which Iran's regional position has strengthened. Or if that's maybe even just a continuation of that process that you named as starting in 2019 of some of these states being like, well, okay, this is our region, and winning with force alone does not seem like it's going to work. So we need to come up with some other sustainable mode of relating to one another and hedging against each of these competing visions and projects of hegemony.
I mean, one of the conditions for Saudi normalization with Israel was that they would want a NATO-like security deal with the US, right? The reason is, I mean, they have two threats in the region. They have Iran and they have Israel, and they want to be protected from both without having to invest heavily in a military. Because investing in a military does sort of raise questions among your neighbors. I'm not talking only about Iran. You could see that UAE would feel equally as threatened by this. But at the same time, it's to, free them from the burden of having to do so at all. And I think this is an illusion that they have had to wake up from twice. Once when the Houthis attacked them and American sort of air defense did nothing. And the second time was now, is that when you have a sort of a region like this one where now they know that if Israel and Iran are in war, it will spill out to the Gulf. And in that situation, America or the U.S. forces were more concerned with defending Israel than they were with defending the Gulf. And there was at least a few statements at the time coming out of the Gulf expressing sort of dissatisfaction with American defenses. And I think this became an issue. So the Gulf has no choice at this moment but to reconsider these sort of security deals that they had prior, these security arrangements that depended heavily on the US. Whether this ends up in sort of like a utopian sort of cooperation situation in the region, that's highly unlikely. But I think what's happening right now, through these negotiations and downstream from these negotiations is precisely this. Everyone is trying to figure out what position they're in, what they can hedge against or what they need to hedge against, and what concessions they can get from their opponents. And what you can see with these sort of side alliances that are happening, that they're not deeper, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi, Egypt. I mean, this is the fact that they're coordinating is huge, but it doesn't mean that this will culminate in some sort of huge security deal that runs across the region. The point of it is to signal that we're now looking for alternative arrangements. And some of, mid-war, when Saudi Arabia at least leaked that they were proposing a non-aggression pact for the entire region. I mean, that is the other side of a security arrangement with the entire region. So this idea does exist, But I think for the Gulf, at least, it's a question of how to contain Iran, or at least arrive at some sort of agreement with Iran that neutralizes whatever security threat they feel from them in the future and deter Israel. Because they understand now that Israel is also looking to expand. If they get another sort of opportunity, they will try to militarily dominate the region. But, I mean, this is what's so frustrating about the Lebanon deal, about how rushed it was, is that no one's making any sort of grand statements about what they want. The Saudis and the Gulf in general will say, we want the nuclear deal or the talks between the Americans and the Iranians to address our concerns. The UAE made these sort of discrete arrangements with Israel during the war. But no one's making any grand sort of moves yet. Everyone's waiting, except Lebanon. The weakest link decided to make this grand move of an agreement, a final agreement. Well, now they're saying it's not a final agreement. It's a framework. The foreign minister today was only talking about how it's just the beginning of a deal, a beginning of a negotiation. But yeah, I think the region will likely look very different in the next decade.
Yeah. I mean, I think, an obvious question that this raises, or a player in the middle of all of this that is kind of stuck in between all of these competing forces and has to figure out what to do is Syria. And, we've talked a bit about how Assad responded and failed to meet this moment and the consequences of that. But I'm curious how you see the new regime in Syria factoring into all of this. Because, as we've talked about, right, through the MOU, Israeli aggression against Hezbollah directly is somewhat contained, and that has led to them trying to pursue disarmament through these other tracks. And we've talked about, kind of leveraging influence over the Lebanese state and through this normalization or this framework agreement to try to force disarmament that way. But at least if the reporting is to believe, there's also been pressure directly on Ahmed al-Shara from the Americans or at the request of the Israelis to go intervene into Lebanon directly and fight against Hezbollah. And, this seems, I guess, like out of the question, that he would be crazy enough to do something like that. But even beyond that, along the terms we've been talking about, thinking pragmatically, he might have his own reasons even to pursue something in the other direction or some kind of understanding with the Axis members as a hedge against the Israeli threat, because as of right now, Israel is gobbling up his territory. I mean, there was just a report yesterday that Israel is setting up civilian settlements in Syria, and they seem like they have no ambition in terms of giving Syrian land back that they have recently colonized. And now, of course, I have no illusions about al-Shara and his fidelity to the Syrian people or his, willingness to confront Israel. But at a certain point, he does have to think about his survival. So yeah, I'm curious how you assess the calculation of his government in trying to finesse his way through this moment and survive all of these competing pressures.
I mean, so it's a deeply awkward position to be put in, where the president of the United States is delegating you to get rid of a regional force, a militant group that Israel could not get rid of. Even entertaining the idea is ludicrous, because can you imagine the type of sectarian undertones if they agreed? I mean, it would be Sunni Syrian regime that entering Lebanon to get rid of a Shia group. It would spark the type of sectarian, it would reignite the same sort of sectarian strife that was sort of initiated by the first civil war, by the civil war in Syria. So it's already ludicrous on that level, because, the region no longer looks like that. But on the other side of it, yeah, he had to maneuver his way out of it. And so this deal that they, the agreement they signed yesterday with Lebanon was sort of this attempt at, saying we will intervene in Lebanon, we will play a part, but we cannot play the sort of classical Syrian guardianship role that the Assad regime used to play up until 2005. And we will not play the Hezbollah role that Hezbollah played for the Assad regime in Syria. We're incapable of doing either of those, but we can play an economic and diplomatic role. And I think that was their attempt at sort of, one, ensuring the region at Lebanon, that they have no intentions of, because, they are also, I don't think they're very trusted, but no one has that much trust in ex-Al-Qaeda militants that are running a country now. And so they have to also make it very, very explicit that they have no intentions of going through with anything of the sort. And so, yeah, I think that Shibani visit, the fact that he went at the Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, met with the most prominent Shia representative in the country, was to signal that we're not doing this. We can think of other ways.
So I wanted to close out by asking about where Lebanon as a whole is going in the near future. Because one of the primary goals that Israel has mentioned in signing this agreement is to force the Lebanese army to fight Hezbollah directly, not just for the IDF to raise villages and then hand over the scorched earth to the Lebanese army to then govern. Them in America, I know Marco Rubio in particular, have talked for months about quote-unquote vetted Lebanese army units, with Israel's ambassador specifically saying that they didn't want anybody with cousins in Hezbollah. And it feels very obvious that they are saying that they don't want Shias without saying that explicitly. So How do you judge the likelihood of sliding back into civil conflict, civil war, God forbid, as that seems to be what Israel is really gunning for at the moment?
I really don't see it happening. I mean, they're basically saying they want sort of units from the Lebanese armed forces that are neither Shia nor from the south to enter the south and fight these highly trained southerners. But I mean, it's a ridiculous thought. I don't know if civil war is a political choice, you know? It would have to be a political choice, and I don't think there is space for that political choice in Lebanon at the moment. You know, almost immediately, if such a thing were to happen, the LAF would fracture immediately, you know? A huge part of the LAF comes from Shia backgrounds, you know? And it's certainly not the case that it's necessary that Christian LAF commanders would be in any way, or Sunni LAF commanders would be any way, would even indulge the idea of entering South Lebanon and fighting other Lebanese people for Israeli goals. I think it's extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely for that to happen. You could imagine perhaps Israelis funding militias like they did previously, you know, arming militias like they did previously. But I don't think there is that sort of will in Lebanon at the moment. I mean, you can look at during that period of displacement. I mean, almost 1 million people were displaced in Lebanon. I mean, obviously there were tensions, there were social tensions, and everyone was sort of expecting explosions to happen. But nothing really happened. I mean, there were certain moments where things were recorded, but nothing really happened, you know? There weren't these immense sort of clashes. A huge amount of Shias from Lebanon were in Christian and Sunni areas, and nothing happened. So I don't think there's this appetite for civil war in Lebanon. And doing it so explicitly for Israeli sort of reasons, to satisfy Israeli objectives, would be deeply unpopular. So I just don't see it happening. Hopefully. You never know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just leaves the question open of what forces then go on to shape the balance of power in the region, because it does seem like all of this recent conflict and these recent agreements and really the US-Iran war have raised the threshold for armed conflict for everyone. I mean, maybe not for the Israelis, but it's raised it enough for the Americans that they seem at least on one level willing to exercise some amount of constraint on the Israelis. And the Israelis know, you know, they're crazy, but they know that the leash may be long, but you don't want to get choked in it, because their political support in the United States is of vital importance, and they may be able to get away with something in the short term, but if it is at the cost of their political structure in the medium or long term, it may not be viable. So I guess that just leaves the question then of how these diplomatic tracks that are in contest with one another, how they resolve. What happens to the Israeli position in southern Lebanon when you have a higher threshold for war, and yet nevertheless these contradictory diplomatic pressures? And I don't have an answer, and I don't expect you to have an answer, but I think it is, you know, part of the broader ambiguity and haze that really defines this moment and this time, and that all these actors that you're talking about as exercising caution and, you know, trying to see where the chips fall. It really is this kind of period of ambiguity, of hegemonic transition, and people awaiting a new order, but at the same time, they are the very actors that will go on to shape it. Nasser, thank you so much for joining us. This was just a really enriching conversation, and we appreciate you taking the time and all the work that you do. You have, I don't think we named it specifically, but you have a recent piece out in the New Left Review talking about some of these issues called Interim Contours, and we will be sure to link it in the show notes. Thanks again once more so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, guys.